I came back to Howard's house, and days passed and weeks passed, and I was sort of in a fog. I was thinking nervously about all sorts of things. I was thinking a lot about the idea of the self. The self, or as it's known from the inside, I. You know, that strange little thing that everyone has, that odd, tiny organ which the surgeons can't touch. I remembered being a boy and always reading these books which would refer excitedly to certain parts of the body as being generously endowed with nerve endings. And now I wondered idly if the self was. On the whole, I thought not. It probably had no nerve endings at all. Anyway, my mind was racing and speeding and in a peculiar condition, and one afternoon I was sort of pacing back and forth in Howard's living room, as I often was on such afternoons, pacing and brooding, and I was sort of thinking about the fact that I always walked around with this extremely stooped posture, with my head sort of hanging down toward the floor, and I suddenly asked myself, why is that exactly? Could it possibly be because my head is too heavy? Because it's simply filled up with too much stuff? With these rather large trunks, suitcases, and worthless junk? And then I wondered, well, what about that noise I always hear, that intolerable noise which comes from somewhere inside my head? And I realized consciously for the first time that, rather like a singer who accompanies his own singing on the piano or guitar, I accompanied my life with a sort of endless inner tinkling, a sort of endless noodling or murmuring, a sort of awful inner murmuring of reportage and opinions, idiotic arpeggios of self-approbation. Yes, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing, and this is the right thing to be doing now, because... and this is right, because... and this is right, because... I thought of all the sincere consideration which I gave to my future, to my plans, you know, and all the solemn concern which I lavished each day on the events of my past, my memories, as we call them, wiping away a few tears. And I wondered, is all this really tremendously valuable, or is it perhaps just a bit unnecessary when you consider the fact, rather often overlooked, that the past and the future don't actually exist? I mean, I sit around thinking about them from morning till night, but you know, where are they? Where are they? They're not here. And God knows they're certainly not anywhere else, I would say. So what is it supposed to mean to me if someone tells me that the trousers I'm wearing were worn yesterday by a man with my name, a man who did this, a man who did that, or that they'll be worn tomorrow by a man who's going to be doing something or other? It all means exactly nothing to me because none of those people actually exist.
Suddenly there was a group of rather quiet demonstrations on some rather quiet streets, leading people to ask, well, were these demonstrations the usual fakes, or could they be real this time? Could we possibly be seeing the awakening of the enemy after all these years? Were the dirt eaters somehow gently stirring? And were certain people whose hands were nicked in 100 places suddenly making their presence felt? That would be funny after we'd been told for so long that people of this sort no longer existed. And then, perhaps as a consequence of these developments, or maybe not, well, to use that perennially popular metaphor from cards. There were cabinet shuffles over and over. And every time that the big governmental deck would be cut, more people we'd never heard of would rise to the top of it. Was it a card game or a card trick? The old office holders, the filthy herd of swine whom we vaguely knew and would even vaguely nod to at cocktail parties, was quietly replaced by a new herd of swine whom we didn't know. The new generation who dressed in new colors, those chalky colors, yellow and pink, and various greens, and lived in new neighborhoods, and even ate in new restaurants with new styles of cooking.
When I was growing up, there was an uncle of mine who always used to tell me, "Look, we are rats. All of our family have always been rats, and you too will be a rat, my boy." Now, everyone knows that rats are a little bit greedy. And perhaps they're a little bit narrow-minded as well because of their narrow faces. But my uncle always said that I should never be ashamed of being a rat. Rats aren't bad, he said. They're not mean or cruel. They're simply doing what they can to survive. Well, the point is that Howard, you see, in contrast to my uncle, was a rather contrary son of a bitch. He, too, was born a rat. He was brought up to be a rat. But he sort of declined to be one. He simply refused. And the story was the same with Bob and Arthur and all of their friends. And Judy, of course, was brought up to believe that the worst thing in the world that a person could be was actually a rat. And so all of these people believed themselves to be tiny, beleaguered creatures, horribly oppressed in this world of rats. This world where the government was run by rats, where the crude, survival-driven taste of rats was everywhere triumphant. And far from wondering whether Howard was a rat, they actually begged him to become their great leader in the war against the rats. The war against everything for which they held the rats responsible, from the unattractive figurines recently introduced into the sculpture garden to the lamentable fact that there were no more free concerts. And for about 15 minutes, I myself was invited to become a sort of foot soldier in the war against the rats, if you want to see it that way. Never mind you, invited to join the ranks of the officers' corps. Not quite the right material, I'm sure you understand. Now, isn't that sad, his own son-in-law? But perhaps almost worthy to be a sort of low-grade, cheerful cannon fodder. But anyway, all this talk about war and soldiers leads us to the much-discussed question of enemies, you see. And that is a question that we really have to face. I mean, when people refer to the enemy, our enemies, they're referring basically to what someone once called the snarling, snapping, unmuzzled dogs